You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview Roger Gottlieb. Roger, a philosophy professor at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, is the author of the novel The Sacrifice Zone, which has an environmental theme to it. I'm here with Roger Gottlieb, who is an author and Worcester Polytechnic Institute professor. Roger, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay. For my day job, I'm professor of philosophy at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I've written or edited 21 books on political philosophy, ethics, religious life, contemporary spirituality, the Holocaust, and so forth. Lately, in the last several years, I've turned to fiction. I wrote a short story book called Engaging Voices, which covered many of the themes of the environmental movement. And the subject of this podcast, my novel, The Sacrifice Zone.
Now, as you mentioned in your introduction, you've written a novel titled The Sacrifice Zone. Without spoiling too much of your book, what is The Sacrifice Zone about, and why did you use that title for your book?
Okay, the term The Sacrifice Zone is a term from the environmental movement, the environmental world, and the sacrifice zone is an area so polluted it can never be cleaned up. And so the suggestion, the question that the book, the novel raises is, in a way, comparatively simple. What do we do when we look head on at suffering, at pain, at distress, at loss that we can't fix? And so it follows in its major theme the lives and interaction of two environmental activists. One is a professor in his early 50s who, by not really paying attention to what was going on in his garden and not having his soil checked for lead and having a big vegetable garden, actually poisoned his beloved daughter with lead because he didn't study it, he didn't test the soil. So that prompts him to put away his research into 19th century literature and become an avid environmentalist. In what he studies, he finds so much distress, so many problems, so many things that aren't being done, responded to in a decent way. And while he's active, he's also consumed with rage. And then he meets a woman named Sarah, who's 15 years his junior, who's been an environmental activist since she graduated from college. And she's done all kinds of things, worked with all kinds of problems, resisting fracking in a little town in Pennsylvania, dealing with the pollution that comes from open pit mines in the American Southwest that poisons Native Americans. She is different. She has a knack for enjoying her life, for loving people. She cries when things are sad, and she gets briefly angry at the loss, at the waste, at the destruction. But she has a knack for enjoying life. So the question is, what is her knack? And so in a way, this is a description of an environmental saint, not somebody holy with white robes, but a woman who wears battered running shoes and farts and makes silly jokes, but is able to express and show love despite the suffering. The second theme of the book, the sort of the subsidiary plot, is about a much more personal kind of pain. And it's a study of a woman named Anne, whose older sister, Lily, becomes a heroin addict. And through her addiction, she pretty much destroys the family in terms of stealing and lying and coming and going and just making it impossible to function. And Anne is so taken up with her sister's suffering that she is overwhelmed by it, and she must find a relief. And the relief she finds is Buddhist meditation. So she becomes more and more serious as a meditator. And then as Lily's behavior gets more and more destructive, at one point she brings a thief into their upper middle class house, and the thief breaks her mother's jaw. She just can't take it. She goes for a 3-month retreat in Thailand at a Buddhist retreat center where you meditate 12 hours a day. And she stays for another 3 months. Then after that, she comes back to America. She gets a job working in a Buddhist center. And through a variety of things happening, she becomes a renowned Buddhist teacher. And she's got her own center up in Vermont. But then something is happening. Her control, her emotional withdrawal, her inability to face pain, she just wants to meditate it away, starts to erupt again. And she goes through a crisis. So as Anne, the Buddhist teacher, cannot cure her sister's heroin addiction and cannot solve the pain her parents are going through. And as Daniel cannot live as an environmentalist without the rage and the despair, well, you have a model of somebody who can, Sarah, and Anne must find her way to something else, and she does. So that's, in a nutshell, or a rather large nutshell, that's the sacrifice zone.
As you mentioned a little bit ago, you described your character in the sacrifice zone, Sarah, as an environmental saint. Could you name a few people in real life you would consider to be environmental saints?
I think there are people who have done incredible work. Think of Rachel Carson, writing Silent Spring, which was the first systematic study of scientific evidence that pesticides were bad for wildlife and ultimately would be bad for human being. She wrote this book while she was suffering from cancer, cancer almost certainly caused by environmental causes from where she grew up. The work, she was assailed by the pesticide manufacturers as a lesbian, as a communist, as an old maid, all this kind of nonsense they talked about her. And she carried through despite her illness. Chico Mendes was a member of a tribe in the rainforest, and he was trying to defend the rainforest against the ranchers who would cut down the trees and plant soybeans to feed cows. And 5 years later, without the trees, the soil would turn arid. So these are people, and Chico Mendes was murdered by people working for the ranchers. So these are people who suffered a great deal, who gave up a great deal. I don't know them personally. They might have been mean in person. They might have been really uptight. They might have not have been able to deal with their emotions. So I wanted to imagine what a person would like this would be. It's in a sense what I would like to be as I go through my periods of extreme despair about what we're doing. I mean, I have been studying this stuff since the early mid 1990s. Almost 30 full years. Periodically, people say to me, "Oh, Roger, that stuff you were talking about, global warming, I guess that's real." Yeah, it's real. And it's not as if I had some secret source of information. You know, I get the real dope that it's hidden from everybody else. No, I just read beyond the headlines. I just read some environmental magazines. I read some books by environmental journalists. It wasn't that hard to find, but people were avoiding. So I want to know how can I continue to do the work I'm doing? I don't know how much longer. I'm not a young buck anymore. And Sarah is somebody who lives a life that I do at my best. And what I mean by that is I'm engaged. I try to do what I can, and I'm not consumed with rage or fear or despair. There's nothing irrational about being frightened. I live in the city of Boston, and we had several weeks this summer when the smoke from the fires in Canada made it unhealthy to go outside. What do you tell your children? Sorry, we broke the air. You can't go outside and play in summertime when they're off school. I have a little place in Vermont that I go to be in the country, and there were times when the air in Vermont from those same fires was worse than the air in Boston. That's Vermont. And Vermont's everybody's picture of the tiny little towns and the beautiful hills and the foliage and all this kind of thing. It was unhealthy to go outside. Now, how is one to respond to this as the fossil fuel companies get bigger and sell more and are very much on track for producing more oil, more natural gas, when the banks have invested, it was last year or the year before, they invested $3 trillion with a T, $1 trillion in fossil fuel. That's how much they lent to those companies. What are we doing? What are we doing? So the environmentalist is the person who at least has the courage to open their eyes. And I know for many years, I was a political philosopher as part of the New Left. I dealt with the anti-war issues and students' rights issues. I resisted anti-Semitism, racism. I was scared to look at the environmental information. I was scared to look at it because I had a deep emotional connection to nature. And I was scared to know what was going on because it wasn't hard to figure out that in a world economy run by capitalist corporations, they would eat everything they could, sell everything they could, lead everybody to buy everything they could. It was clear that was going on, but I was too emotionally insecure I was too emotionally undeveloped to face it. And then various things happened. I was able to make that transition. So what would it be like to really be a saint? Not a saint who lives in a cave somewhere, or lives on a mountaintop, or lives in a monastery, but a saint who's totally engaged with resisting mountaintop removal. One of the powerful scenes, I think, in the novel is when a man comes up from West Virginia and meets with Sarah and says, mountaintop removal destroyed my town. I'm the only one who hasn't left. Is there any way you can help me? And she goes down there and they try to help, and they get physically assaulted by people who represent the mining company. Mountaintop removal is a different kind of mining. You don't go into the earth, you just cut the top off the damn mountain. And it leaves incredible amount of refuge and poisonous materials behind. When Trump became president, one of the first things that his environmental side did was lessen the controls on the kinds of pollution that can come from mountaintop removal mining. Just let all those dangerous minerals, all that toxic stuff, go into the streams there. Who cares? So when you're aware of things like this, and I must get 8 environmental emails a day from this organization, that organization, from environmental websites like Grist. I get all this information. And sometimes it's overwhelming. I got to turn it off. But since I teach this stuff and I write about it, I have to know about it. So what is it to carry through at times like this? What is it to resist the environmental degradation, which is only getting worse for the most part? The environmental degradation, which is, it costs America, the United States government, $150 billion a year. That's a very, very, very low estimate. It's only going to go up. Where is the money going to be to educate children, to take care of the elderly, to help people with special needs? Where's that money going to go for constantly rebuilding homes? What happens when the farms in Ohio, as happened to some farms a couple of years ago, a nice farmer, his land, his crops were underwater for 6 weeks. That was it for those crops. Now you can have crop insurance. You can do that, pay back the lost crops. But how many lost crops can you pay back if you're also paying to rebuild after floods and take care of people in a drought? On and on and on. Now, I can go on with this information until people listening may want to scream. I don't blame them. Sometimes screaming is the most appropriate response. But after you've screamed, after you've expressed yourself, what then? And can you still, as Sarah does, can you still enjoy sex and a beautiful vision, sight that you see, and the flowers in spring? Can you take all that in and take that in with an awareness of reality? Can you do that? In an example that she uses to explain herself to Dana, she says, imagine that your mother, God forbid, imagine that your aged mother is in the hospital. She's got a terrible illness. Things don't look good. Maybe they'll work out okay, but things don't look good right now. What are you going to do? Are you going to spend all your time and energy just saying, oh my God, mommy's dying, it's terrible, what's going to happen? I wish I could do something. Or would you go to her room? Would you hold her hand, stroke her hair, sing to her, be with her? Would you show her what love you can while she's still alive? Well, what's a bigger cliche than Mother Nature? But isn't it a true cliche? Where do we all come from, if not from the process of evolution? What is it that makes possible the stuff we build our houses with, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we grow? And all of that is in very bad shape, very bad shape. So what do? We try to find some way to give love. A small way, a big way. I'm no environmental hero. I'm a good writer. My books are pretty good. Great. I teach my courses. Good. I belong to some organizations. I've gone on some demonstrations. But I'm trying to give love, just like if it was my mother in the hospital, I would try to give love to her. So if we can find a way to face the truth and not be lost in despair, not be lost in depression, not be lost in grief, nothing wrong with feeling those feelings. Feel the grief. Grief tells you that something has to change, that your way of understanding the world has to shift. Well, the notion that it's all going to be okay the notion that our children or our grandchildren will have a easily livable world to live in terms of the natural world, in terms of the air, the water, the food. That's just not true. It's just not true. Can you imagine somebody who has a 2, 4, 6, 8, 10-year-old child now? What type of world is that child going to have in 25 years? The temperatures keep rising. The storms keep getting bigger. The droughts keep getting bigger. You can read a report about groundwater depletion in the United States, how we're taking water out of our aquifers far faster than it's being replenished by rainfall. What will we drink? What will we use for our agriculture? Is there some comprehensive national program addressing this? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So if we face the reality, it's very overwhelming. And still, the character of Sarah here is able to carry through. She's able to carry through. She's able to look at the little pond near where she lives. And I place her in this part of Boston that I live in, which is called Jamaica Pond, which is within the city limits, Jamaica Plain rather, within the city limits, but it's got a lot of green, including this just wonderful pond that's 1.5 miles around. It's not a little thing. And as you go down to the pond, you can see seagulls and cormorants, occasionally a heron. I saw a deer there once. I told him to go the hell back the other way and not come any closer to the parkway that runs by the edge of the pond. And she can look at that pond, look at the clouds changing color, look at a glint of light off the wings of a seagull reflected across the pond. She can look at these utterly gorgeous things and deeply, deeply appreciate them, deeply celebrate them, deeply feel gratitude that it ever was, that we got to be here. Because, there's no ironclad universal rule that humans should exist, the earth should exist, that life should have been possible on this planet. There's no ironclad rule that we should be able to see in color. There are species that can only see in gradations of black and white.
Roger, I have more questions to ask.
Go ahead.
So finish up what you're. Okay.
I forgot. Go ahead, Aaron. I'm sorry. A professor's habit. I go on and on. Go ahead.
In addition to the Sacrifice Zone, you've written many other books. Without spoiling too much of them, what are some of them about?
Okay, well, I'll take the one that it sort of got reviewed more than some of the others. It's called A Greener Faith, Religious Environmentalism and Our Planet's Future. And it was the first single-authored book, which was a full-length 300-page study of religious environmentalism. What has the environmental crisis, how has that affected religions throughout the world? What proclamations do they make? How do they reinterpret ancient scripture? Can you read the first 5 books of the Bible that we Jews call the Torah? Can you read that and find environmental themes? Well, you can. What are those environmental themes? Is it one message or a variety of messages? Can you look back at the Christian tradition and see somebody like St. Francis, who used to walk down the road and take worms out of the road and put them by the side of the road so they wouldn't get run over by carts? There are religious environmental themes in traditional religion. There are environmental proclamations and activity by contemporary religious leaders. Pope Francis, current Pope, put forth a very damning critique of capitalism and its effect on the environment. We're turning the world, said Pope Francis, into an immense pile of filth. And there has been religious activism in a variety of ways. And there's one chapter with interviews with 5 environmentalists, 5 different religious environmentalists. So I think that's the religious environmentalism is one of the positive stories of the last 25 years, that all the major religions have some degree of environmentalism. Even evangelical Christianity and Southern evangelicals, who tend to be extremely conservative, they support Trump, they're against gay marriage. There was an evangelical environmental network that did things. You'll like this one. It's cute. They had a campaign called What Would Jesus Drive? And the idea was, let's take a look at the golden rule and apply it to transportation choices. So they went to Detroit and they confronted the automakers about fuel efficiency. And they went on a cavalcade through the South, raising issues about how transportation is a moral issue and therefore a religious issue. And they ended up at the country's largest Christian rock festival. Now, I'm a Jew, I'm a left-wing Jew. What do I know about Christian rock festivals, right? But they did that. And there were over 1,500 news articles about what they'd done. So that was one of the books. And I'll tell you a more recent book I did called Morality and the Environmental Crisis, which raises, again, a fairly simple question with difficult answer. We all want to think of ourselves as good people. No matter how terrible you might think somebody else is, that person thinks of himself as a good person. The terrorist who blows up, quote, innocent people thinks they're fighting for a great cause. What does it mean to think of ourselves as nice people when we live in a society, a modern industrial society, and if we're not at the bottom economically, if we're anywhere but the bottom economically, our normal conduct of life is contributing to the environmental crisis? I drive to work. It's 45 miles, an hour away from where I live. I live in Boston and I teach in a city called Worcester. You turn on your lights, right? You eat your food, which is transported. The average plate of food in the United States travels 1,500 miles before you eat it. Any of us who eat eggs or cheese or chicken or pork or beef are part of the industrial agricultural system, which is enormously polluting, both in terms of physical pollution and in terms of greenhouse gases for the climate crisis. So what is it like? So I investigate daily life, ethical theories, the nature of rationality, political resistance along those lines. So those are two of them.
Are all your books self-published, or all your books traditionally published, or are some self-published and others traditionally published?
The only self-published is the novel, The Sacrifice Zone, which is what's called a hybrid publisher, which is, on the one hand, it's self-published. On the other hand, they exercise a restraint. They don't accept everybody who wants it. They have to approve the book to get it self-published. I tried to get the novel taken by a standard agent, and no such luck. Every other book is by a, quote, normal publisher. I have three, I think, with Oxford University Press. Morality and the Environmental Crisis was published by Cambridge University Press. I have stuff with Routledge, which is a very large academic publisher, and Rowman and Littlefield, a large academic publisher, and Crossroad, which is a religious environmental publisher. So I've been around the circle in a number of different ways.
If you have a typical writing routine, what is that like for you?
Well, I have had a very demanding family life because one of my children has multiple handicaps, multiple special needs. She's now 37, thank God, alive and doing well, living in a group home. But it has been one doctor's appointment, management crisis issue, one after another. So dealing with everything she needed. I mean, my wife had an enormous amount to do. I had an enormous amount to do. I didn't have any time for a writer's block. So typically, depending on the subject matter, I would go into an area and I'd read for a year or two and get a sense of my theory of the whole area. I did this with 19th and 20th century political philosophy, radical political philosophy. I did it with the Holocaust. I did it with the relation between religion and progressive politics in a book called Joining Hands. And then I write. I make some kind of very rough outline. I have some notes based on my reading, and I get up in the morning. I do yoga. I eat breakfast, and then I write. And I try to do 1,500 to 2,000 words a day. And usually in 2 hours, I can do that. And then later in the afternoon, I might edit what I've written or write a little bit more or go back to my reading. But should I say it? It's fast. I'm a very fast writer. I've got some colleagues who look at me and they hate me because, 8 years later, they're working on the same book and I published 3 more. It's just something I can do. Don't ask me to fix your car or paint your house or cure your asthma, but I can write and talk. Those are my gifts. I have some nature photography too on my website, but I'm a comparatively fast writer. I've also done 150 articles. I've written countless book reviews and scholarly essays and more popular essays too. I mean, I've been on all sorts of websites, from the Wall Street Journal to Pathos to Grist, to Los Angeles Review of Books, etc. Things like that.
About the articles you've written that you just mentioned moments ago, what are some subjects or topics that you've written articles about?
Well, I've done a number on the environment, a number where I tried to make people aware of the growth and scope of religious environmentalism. I've written on political life. I wrote one thing where I said, how come no Christians are running for president? This was a couple of cycles ago. And I pointed out that some of the essential teachings of Christianity, which include things like love your enemies, none of these people practice. Blessed are the peacemakers and love your enemies. Well, these people generally tend to be people who celebrate violence and celebrate hating your enemy. I had it one where I did, these are 4 news stories that you'll never hear about. One where a bunch of women on motorcycles go up and throw acid in the face of some fundamentalist, rabid jihadist who's been throwing acid in the faces of women who dare to learn to read. And another story was how the CEOs of the powerful fossil fuel companies put out a proclamation apologizing for everything terrible that they've done, including 30 years of lying about global warming, which they have done. This is a matter of widely known now, and how they were going to use all their power and influence and money to deal with global warming. So that was the kind of thing like that. So it's about political life. It's about spiritual life. I had a book review column for many, many years in the progressive Jewish and political magazine called Tikkun, Tikkun. Tikkun is a Hebrew word meaning repair, the idea that it's up to human beings to repair what's broken in the world. And I reviewed there everything from books about yoga to a book about a memoir of a woman who was a political prisoner, Latin America, a nun who had been a political prisoner and had been tortured, to books about religious history, to books about the relation between religion and politics. Sort of anything I wanted. The editor, Rabbi Michael Lerner, he said, do what you want, Roger. So since I practiced yoga for 40 years, I enjoyed doing that. And the book about the political prisoner impressed me. I know there was another book. This one will is really kind of send shivers up and down your spine. And it's called Poisoned for Profit. And it's about the environmental poisoning of America's children and how all the diseases that these kids have, which are environmentally based, and all the chemicals and all the resistance to doing anything about it, and the lobbying that the chemical companies use to affect government regulation. And my title for the review was A Terrible Book. And I said, I mean this literally. It's terrifying. So those are some of the things. I'm also written on the Arab-Israeli conflict, trying to get a sane, balanced, understanding view of it, which is not easy. So those are some of the things I've written about.
One final question: what is your work as a philosophy professor at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute like?
Well, it's a nice school. Students are intelligent. They're hardworking. They're very nice people. I mean, you hear all these things about students screaming at professors about one thing or another. In 40 years there, I think I've had disrespect from a student maybe 3 times. They're lovely young people. They're unbelievably ignorant. They have not been educated, especially because their interests, it's an engineering school, their interests are computers and building machines and building buildings and going into business. That's their interest. But we do have an active humanities program, and they have to take 6 courses in some area of the humanities, and philosophy and religion is the one I teach in. So on the one hand, there's a certain enjoyment and value being in places with a bigger liberal arts program where we'd have philosophy majors. We have hardly any of those. On the other hand, you read about the pseudo-political correctness, and I say pseudo because there's nothing politically correct about it, about students screaming about pronouns and about demanding sort of, you swear on the Bible, be against racism, all this nonsense, which is not leftism. It's a kind of hysteria of Stalinism. You don't have any of that at WPI. In fact, yesterday, there was a student panel, about the current war between Israel and Hamas. And the panel was organized jointly by Hillel, which is the Jewish students, and the Muslim Students Association. Now, I don't know how many universities have students who are able to work together. Did they see it the same way? No, of course not. How could you? But they realized it was really important to listen to the other side. Now, that's the kind of thing you can get at WPI when they, get past just their basic political passivity. Most of them are basically liberal, but most of them are very passive. So in that ways, it's a very nice place to teach, and I can teach what I want. I can assign what I want. I teach a lot of environmental philosophy, social and political philosophy. I have a whole course on spirituality. I have a book called Spirituality: What It Is and Why It Matters. It won a book award because it was so terrific. It's a lovely place to teach. Thanks for asking about that.
Roger, you were an amazing guest for this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Aaron, thank you very much for having you. I appreciated your questions. And as we say, go in good health.
I enjoyed interviewing Professor Gottlieb. I might be busy writing books set on fictional planets when I'm not doing work on this podcast, but in real life, there is no planet B once our Earth becomes uninhabitable. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.